It started with a leak, not a scandal, not a rumor. Just a single line buried in a confidential cable demanding that one African nation surrender 60% of its oil and gold reserves within 48 hours. The sender, Donald J. Trump. The recipient, a 35-year-old soldier-turned-president named Captain Ibrahim Traoré. There were no negotiations, no meetings, no diplomacy. Just a demand: give up control of your nation's wealth or face the full weight of American power. Sanctions, sabotage, maybe worse. But what happened next wasn't what anyone in Washington expected, because the man who received that letter in a quiet office in Ouagadougou didn't flinch. He didn't call for help. He didn't ask for permission. He stood up, looked at the document, and told his commanders, "Tell the Americans, Burkina Faso is not for sale." And just like that, the world changed. This is not a story you'll hear on the evening news. It's not trending on Wall Street. But it's one every American needs to hear, especially those of us old enough to remember when leadership meant courage, not compliance. When standing up to empires came at a cost, but meant something. So let me ask you, what would you do if a foreign power demanded your country's future in exchange for peace? Would you sign away your children's gold? Or would you fight back? Because one African president just said no, not with violence, but with strategy, courage, and a voice that echoed far beyond his borders. Subscribe if you believe dignity is worth more than any deal. Share this if you believe the truth deserves to be heard before it's erased. It wasn't just a letter. It was a threat dressed in bureaucracy, hand-delivered by a former U.S. military attaché flanked by armed contractors. 7 pages. Confidential. Cold. Inside, it didn't speak of partnership. It spoke of ownership. And at the top, in bold red handwriting, Traoré has current hours. According to multiple sources, this document, crafted under the direction of Donald J. Trump, laid out a simple, brutal proposal. Burkina Faso must hand over 60% of its oil production and grant U.S.-approved intermediaries full control of its gold export routes. In return, promises, military support, economic cooperation. And one chilling phrase buried in the final paragraph: protection from regime change. It was empire polished with legal language, extortion signed in ink. But here's where the story takes a turn no one expected. The man receiving that threat was not a politician in a suit. He was a captain forged in the fire of insurgency, a man who rose through the ranks not by privilege, but by battlefield grit. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré read the letter, he didn't panic, he didn't blink. He summoned his top generals and said calmly, "If they want our gold, they'll have to take our soil with it." That morning, Burkina Faso changed course. What the U.S. underestimated was how far along Burkina Faso already was. For months, Traoré's government had kept a national secret buried under red dust and silence. Massive oil deposits newly discovered, freshly confirmed. This wasn't speculation. It was verified by a covert team of Russian geologists, Iranian drones, and North Korean technicians. The files were locked away. The drilling had already begun. And then the satellites noticed. Within 48 hours of that first drill breaking soil, American and French intelligence flagged unusual energy activity in the Sahel. Iranian-made machinery was flowing into the region. Venezuelan experts were spotted training local engineers. Encrypted radio traffic referenced something explosive: a sovereign petroleum corridor, African-owned, dollar-free. Washington's response: immediate panic. Across oil boardrooms and government halls, one question was whispered again and again: how do we shut this down before it spreads? For the Trump administration, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about precedent. If one African nation could say no, others might follow. Mali, Niger, Chad, even the Congo. That was the nightmare. That's why the cable didn't ask. It demanded. The narrative was simple: we saved you from terrorism. Now it's time to pay up. Burkina Faso, once painted as a recipient of American counter-terror operations, was now sitting on black gold and gold. The world had changed, but Washington still played by the old rules: threaten, leverage, extract. But Traoré wasn't playing along. Instead of folding, he went public. No polished studio, no teleprompter, just a man in uniform standing in front of the Burkinabe flag. One hand on a folder marked "Confidential, U.S. Threat." His voice calm, his eyes unblinking. He spoke to his people. But the message was global. An offer has been made to sell our oil, our gold, our honor. in exchange for fear. To those behind this insult, Mr. Trump and your backers, you have misjudged us. We are not Libya. We are not Iraq. We are not your playground. You gave us 48 hours. Here is our response. You now have 48 hours to take your greed, your threats, and your arrogance and leave African soil. And then he walked off screen. No questions, no compromise, just a message carved in steel. The reaction across Burkina Faso was instantaneous. Crowds poured into the streets of Ouagadougou chanting his name. Women banged pots and lit candles. Men waved flags and sang old resistance songs. University students printed T-shirts that read, "If CNN hates you, you're doing something right." Traoré's defiance had struck a nerve, not just in his country, but across a continent. In Bamako, in Dakar, in Johannesburg, even in Nairobi. People weren't just watching, they were hoping. Because what he did, what he dared to do was something millions had dreamed of. To say no. And mean it. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rejected the ultimatum, he didn't just ignite a fire, he lit up the continent. Just hours after his national address, the world watched as Burkina Faso's National Assembly convened an emergency midnight session, one kept so secret even most ministers weren't informed until they arrived. Behind closed doors, a historic vote was cast and signed into law before sunrise. All oil and gold reserves within the territory of Burkina Faso are hereby nationalized and permanently protected from any foreign corporate ownership or intervention. Licenses held by French and Canadian companies revoked. U.S.-backed energy survey teams escorted to the border. Ambassadors from Paris and Washington formally notified in writing, no stalling, no appeals. The decision was final. By dawn, the orders hit the ground. Military convoys sealed off gold convoys. Data feeds to foreign companies were severed. Oil drilling equipment was locked down under armed guard. And then Traoré reappeared, this time not in uniform, but in traditional Burkinabe dress standing at a simple wooden podium. "We've been exploited for generations," he said. "Now that we've found our wealth, they want to take it back. But I will not serve empires. I serve a people who have suffered too long. Burkina Faso is not afraid, and I will not negotiate with thieves." Within 72 hours, the palace gates opened to 3 unmarked military planes. There were no weapons on board, no diplomats, just 3 men each wearing combat boots, each carrying one message. "If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch all of us." From Mali came Colonel Assimi Goïta, silent and focused. From Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani, his stare cold and unshaken. From Guinea, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya, proud, direct, unapologetic. They walked into Traoré's office as equals. No handshakes for cameras. No statements for the press, but when they re-emerged, they stood shoulder to shoulder. That image raced across Africa. 3 battle-tested leaders standing with a 4th united not by politics, but by purpose. Within hours, the AES Shield Doctrine was born. Mali sent hardened security advisors to guard oil fields. Niger activated a logistics corridor for defense reinforcements. Guinea opened its airspace for emergency supply drops. This wasn't an alliance written on paper. It was built in trenches, in betrayals, in centuries of shared pain. The message: Burkina Faso will not fall alone. Washington panicked. Behind the scenes, U.S. intelligence launched a multi-pronged operation. CIA field teams increased presence in West Africa. Social media bots flooded platforms with messages labeling Traoré as unstable, erratic, even mentally unfit. Western media networks, CNN, BBC, and Reuters suddenly ran the same headlines: Burkina Faso risks economic ruin. Concerns over humanitarian crisis as isolation deepens. Young leader may be in over his head. The goal was clear: erode legitimacy, spark division, trigger internal dissent. But it backfired. In Ouagadougou, young people remixed CNN segments into protest songs. University walls were covered with murals of Traoré fist-raised standing atop oil barrels. In classrooms, sovereignty workshops popped up overnight. Women's unions brought food and medicine to soldiers guarding mining zones. Farmers delivered fuel and grain to newly nationalized sites. They didn't just support the decision. They lived it, owned it, fought for it. And when Time magazine was forced to put Traoré on its digital cover with the title, "The Man America Can't Bully," even older Africans long skeptical of politics began to believe again. Traoré had become a symbol not just of resistance, but of possibility. Then came the silent footsteps, Russia and China. They didn't arrive with press conferences or military threats. They came with what Traoré needed most: tools, technology, trust. China offered a fully functional oil refinery in 90 days, gold valuation systems independent of Western banks, and trade using digital yuan, not dollars or CFA francs. Russia landed with advanced anti-drone defense systems to protect oil fields from foreign sabotage. To Traoré, they weren't saviors. They were instruments of sovereignty. Burkina Faso wouldn't just own its oil and gold, it would control the value chain from soil to market. And that terrified the old order. He had done the unthinkable. He said no. He survived. And he inspired. In most countries, when a leader defies the world's superpower, fear sets in. People whisper, investors flee, the streets empty out in quiet dread. But in Burkina Faso, something very different happened. The day after Captain Ibrahim Traoré's nationalization decree, there were no protests of panic. There were lines. Lines of young men and women outside volunteer offices. Lines of villagers bringing water and food to military checkpoints. Lines of teachers, retired elders, market sellers, all asking the same question: where do I stand to protect my country? It wasn't just a government act, it became a people's movement. Without waiting for formal orders, communities began organizing defense circles around oil installations and mining zones. They called them guardians of the soil. In the town of Kaya, a group of widows whose husbands died in previous conflicts began cooking meals daily for soldiers guarding the oil rigs. In Tenkodogo, a local imam offered his mosque as a communications hub for coordinating civilian security patrols. In rural Bulsa, school teachers converted blackboards into map walls, tracking volunteer deployments and sharing resource literacy to students. What started as a military response had become civic renewal. For decades, the Burkinabe people had been told that they were poor, dependent, irrelevant. Now, for the first time, they felt something radically different: power. The deeper effect wasn't just in bodies, it was in minds. Universities launched emergency teach-ins on political sovereignty, natural resource law, and anti-imperial economics. Radio stations replaced French music charts with programs on African unity and economic justice. Young Burkinabés coined new phrases: if gold is ours, then decisions must be too. Not Independence Day, but Independence Decade. Don't teach us aid, teach us trade. Even school children began drawing pictures of oil wells guarded not by foreign contractors, but by farmers, engineers, and elders in traditional dress. The message was simple yet revolutionary. This time, it stays ours. Of course, resistance has its costs. Within days of the decree, Western banks froze international accounts tied to the Burkinabe government. Several Western-owned aid agencies announced suspensions due to instability. Investment firms pulled out of infrastructure projects, citing political unpredictability. But Traoré was ready. In a bold move, his government created the National Sovereignty Development Fund, financed not by foreign loans, but by redirected gold and oil revenues. Instead of sending profits to offshore accounts or European capitals, funds began flowing to local programs: road repairs in isolated villages, teacher stipends in conflict zones, microcredit for women-led farming cooperatives, construction of basic oil processing centers for domestic use. These weren't headline-grabbing mega-projects. They were real things for real people. Inside the government, the ripple effect reached deep. The Ministry of Energy was restructured overnight. Instead of foreign consultants, local engineers, many trained abroad but returned home, were brought in to redesign the nation's resource strategy. The Ministry of Finance published a 3-year sovereignty budget outlining how nationalized revenues would replace international debt cycles. The judiciary was ordered to review all existing contracts signed with foreign companies under previous regimes, including possible prosecutions for corruption. Even more shockingly, Burkina Faso suspended participation in several French-backed regional trade frameworks, opting instead to negotiate directly with neighboring AS countries. It was the birth of a new legal and economic identity, one written in the language of self-determination. Captain Traoré wasn't just a president anymore. To many, he became a living constitution, a line in the sand, a reminder that leadership isn't about diplomacy first, it's about dignity first. In public squares, his face appeared next to Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary icon. Old men told stories again. Mothers wept softly. Veterans saluted the TV screen. And most importantly, hope returned. Not the empty kind with foreign slogans and loan conditions, but a fragile, hard-won hope that maybe, just maybe this time, would be different. Traoré hadn't just passed a law, he'd unleashed a transformation. From Washington to London, from Paris to Brussels, the reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was part confusion, part fury, and all denial. At first, the official line was that Trump was acting independently, that the ultimatum was not reflective of U.S. policy. But behind closed doors, no one stopped him. Why? Because he said what the establishment had always believed. We don't care who runs Africa as long as we control what's under the ground. When Traoré went public with the threat, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Because it shattered the illusion that Western powers were benevolent investors. He had pulled the curtain back, and the world saw raw imperial greed. In D.C., oil executives were the first to panic. At ExxonMobil, emergency meetings stretched into the night. Chevron issued internal warnings about African nationalism risks. Halliburton's Africa division reportedly shredded dozens of documents. At the Pentagon, satellite images of US troop movements and anti-drone deployments in Burkina Faso triggered code yellow status updates. Meanwhile, in the media, CNN labeled Traoré reckless and militarizing the Sahel. Fox News called for economic retaliation and warned of a new Russia-China-African axis. Former CIA officials appeared on Sunday panels calling Traoré the next Gaddafi, a populist threat and a puppet of dictators. The State Department walked a tightrope condemning authoritarian moves while still quietly pushing for negotiation. But the damage was done. Because across Africa and in parts of Latin America and Asia, Traoré was becoming a symbol. In China, state-run media praised Burkina Faso's assertion of economic dignity. In Russia, talk shows aired side-by-side footage of Traoré and Putin resisting Western sanctions. In Iran, billboards went up declaring Burkina Faso said no. So can we all. In Europe, the reaction was mixed. France, humiliated by the expulsion of its mining firms, froze development aid. Germany expressed concern about the precedent. Italy quietly opened back-channel talks with Guinea and Mali for access to West African resources, no longer via Washington or Paris. Meanwhile, across the African diaspora in the US, Caribbean, and UK, something rare happened: unity. From church halls in Atlanta to radio stations in Kingston, from Black Studies departments in Chicago to Instagram pages in Lagos, people started sharing one message: he said no, and he lived. In a world addicted to compromise, Traoré's refusal to kneel became the most powerful act of leadership anyone had seen in a long, long time. What is the real cost of dignity? For generations, that question has haunted nations across the global South. They were told the answer was too high, that sovereignty came with sanctions, with coups, with ruin, that it was safer to comply than to resist. But in 2025, on the red soil of Burkina Faso, a 35-year-old soldier named Ibrahim Traoré offered a different answer. He stood in front of cameras holding a folder marked U.S. threat and said clearly, "I would rather die standing than live kneeling." And then he lived. That's what shocked the world. That's what scared Washington. That's what moved millions, not just in Africa, but in communities across the globe that had been told for too long to stay small, stay silent, stay bought. Because Traoré didn't just survive the ultimatum, he rewrote the script. Make no mistake, this is not over. Burkina Faso may have expelled oil giants and nationalized gold, but the system Traoré defied is still alive and well. Private intelligence firms are still flooding social media with smear campaigns. Financial institutions are quietly pulling the levers of isolation. The language of stability and humanitarian crisis is being used to mask economic warfare. And somewhere behind a polished desk, another ultimatum is being drafted, this time perhaps with fewer words and more consequences. Which raises the question, can we continue to trust that economic power will ever respect African sovereignty or anyone's sovereignty without resistance? If you've watched this far, you're part of something rare, a global community that listens beyond headlines, that cares beyond borders. You've just heard a story the world's most powerful voices hoped you'd never hear, and now you have a choice. Will you let this moment pass, or will you help make it matter? Share this video if you believe dignity should never come with a price tag. Subscribe if you believe the soul of Africa and every nation deserves to stand unchained. Comment below. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national stand can survive the next wave of pressure, or is this just the calm before the storm? This isn't just about oil. This isn't just about gold. This is about the world we leave behind for the next leader, the next fight, the next child born under the same sun. Burkina Faso said no. Now the world waits for your answer.